My name is Steve Seitz. Many of you know me as the host of Book Talk. Many more of you, I hope, know me as the author of Sherlock Holmes and the Plague of Dracula. And for the next half hour or so, we're going to take a look inside the world of Sherlock Holmes fandom. Every year, about in early April, early spring, fans of Sherlock Holmes descend on the city of Atlanta to share their love of all things Sherlock Holmes. The event is called the 221B Convention, and they come to learn things, they come to make new friends, have a lot of fun, and actually act silly, as you'll be seeing from the upcoming photos. So if you'll stick with me through the next half hour, let's have a good time and let's hope it's illuminating. And what's your involvement in this convention?
I'm a volunteer, helping out with the convention, first-time volunteer.
Well, I take it you're here because of the great Sherlock Holmes.
Oh yes, yeah, I've been a Sherlock fan since I was a little kid. My parents used to read me the books.
Oh, really?
And my dad was a big mystery fan, and Sherlock Holmes was his absolute favorite.
I see. And do you belong to the Science Society in Atlanta?
Do I belong to?
The Sherlock Holmes Society?
No, I haven't had the time, because right now I'm a single mom, but I'm hoping to get more involved in them because, the interesting things that they do, meetups like this.
Well, so what is it about Sherlock Holmes exactly? Why are we so fascinated after all this time, and why is he more popular than ever?
Well, of course, he's the archetype for any kind of detective, mystery solver, and I think to me, it's just the fascination with the way his brain works, the way he can put together things that are little bits and things here that all of us gloss over. and then bring it together and have a cohesive whole. And the idea that, maybe, we could train our brains to do the same sorts of things. Maybe we'd be able to do that, but we might not be as fascinating as it is.
No, definitely not. You know what surprises me? Sometimes Holmes's methods actually work.
Yeah, and it does. You start looking around and noticing things more, being more aware of what's going on around you.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that out. I also found out you can get into trouble doing that.
Depends on who you're deducting on, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes. Which Holmes, I think, should learn sometimes, especially in the newer versions.
Oh, yeah.
Gets himself in trouble when you do that.
Nope. So what brings you here?
I came with my sister. This is actually her first convention. I've done different conventions, but I fell into the Sherlock Holmes fandom for a long time. And then with Sherlock, the BBC one, and all this sort of rise in popularity, it's become a really fun thing to take part in.
How many conventions do you go to?
Normally I do at least 2 a year because I do artist alley stuff usually. So this one, I don't need to go out just for fun usually.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Next, we'll be talking to my fellow Sherlockian authors to see what makes us tick. The Sherlock Holmes pastiche is a literary industry unto itself. Almost every fan tries to at least write a story, even if it's just a silly fan fiction for the entertainment of fellow fans. But some of us take it seriously, and we do our very best. Up first, we have Lindsay Fay, the author of the critically acclaimed Dust and Shadow, which pits Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper. Of course, if you want to see the full interviews, you'll have to find Book Talk. Lindsay Fay. Oh, Fanboy Steve here. I am with Lindsay Fay, who is a well-known Sherlockian author like myself, and also the head of the Baker Street Babes.
Christina Minenti is the head of the Baker Street Babes, but I'm one of the Baker Street Babes, definitely.
Okay. Anyway, Lindsay's one of the Baker Street Babes. And, God, I gotta look up well.
No, you don't.
Anyway.
This handsome gentleman and I are probably going to interview each other, don't you think?
Yes, I think we are.
Perfect. Excellent.
So, this all comes down, of course, to Sherlock Holmes. So tell me a little bit about how Sherlock came into your life and where he took you.
Sherlock Holmes, where he took me. Goodness, what a great way to phrase that question. That's actually a much better way to phrase that question than I've ever been asked before. Sherlock Holmes, initially, I think I was out of Nancy Drew stories, and I said to my dad, I'm bored, and I would like to read something that is also in the mystery genre. And he said, why don't you read this short story called The Speckled Band? And I always think that that is actually a very interesting way to come to the canon, because if you can take the adventures and the memoirs, etc., all the short stories, you can take them very episodically, and you could just take them like one at a time.
Yeah.
You don't have to do them chronologically at all, because they're not chronologically based. Doyle gave zero shits about all of that.
Yeah.
And so I didn't start with The Study in Scarlet. I started with Speckled Band, and then I was like, oh my god, I have to read everything about Sherlock Holmes. So I always describe it as I'm one of those people who, after reading Sherlock Holmes, never stopped reading Sherlock Holmes. So there are people who read Sherlock Holmes and like, oh, I just read all of those stories and I understand the answers to the cases and the clues, etc., etc. But I never stopped reading them at all, because I just wanted to live in that world with them continually.
I know. I brought down the first volume of Les Klinger's Annotated.
Yep. Yeah. I bought at Costco when I was, I think I was 15. Costco had the William S. Baring Gould
That was
annotated.
just $15 I ever spent. I bought that in 1971.
I was
joined a book club.
obsessed with that edition, like, because it had so much stuff, that like is peripheral to the world, and like.
Well, that taught me the value of research.
Yes, research is important.
Keep that in mind, writers out there. Research is important. You
Yes,
can't just
everyone.
make it up.
Yeah. Well, if you do make it up, then at least have the decency to be in the fantasy genre. or the sci-fi genre, so that you can make it up and it will believe you, as opposed to making up things that didn't actually happen.
Exactly. So, for the benefit of those who have yet to read your book, what approach did you take?
Well, the approach that I took is actually kind of an eccentric one. I knew, I'm going to flatter myself in the sense that I am an obsessed enough nerd that I knew quite a bit about Sherlock Holmes before I ever approached writing Dust and Shadow. I know the difference between a dog cart and a hansom. That's not a problem for me. I know the difference between a shilling and a guinea. I can tell you from Toby the dog and Pompey the dog. So I have some street cred there. But I knew nothing about Jack the Ripper. So this is where I became the ignoramus, and I just relied on other people to help me. I did an enormous amount of research into Jack the Ripper. Apart from doing my own research into Jack the Ripper, I was helped by extraordinarily kind ripperologists. And if anybody has ever thought that Sherlock Holmes fans are really obsessed about detail, ripperologists are right up there. So I'm talking to Stuart P. Evans, I'm talking to Donald Rumbelow.
Wow, you did.
Like, yeah, I talked to all of them, and I talked to them because they believed that I was taking it seriously. And so I'm emailing Donald Rumbelow and Stuart P. Evans and these folks who know way more things about the Ripper murders than I do. And I'm asking them if this manuscript is correct, if I'm getting it right, if I have studied all of the right things, if I'm ignoring anything. And Dust and Shadow, which is my first novel, was fact-checked against really brilliant ripperologists, and that is because they are kind enough to have taken the time to have said, yeah, I would like to tell you whether or not this is correct because I care enough about this subject. So they were awesome. Caleb Carr is on the cover of Dust and Shadow because Caleb Carr was kind enough to read it and say, I think that this person is really paying attention, and that was the blurb that was, thrown on the cover. But the ripperologists, I gotta say, such generous use of their own resources. When I asked them, if I could poach from them, and they helped me tremendously. So, yeah, forever grateful to those people.
And are you continuing writing Sherlock? I notice your current book you have, That's a Dog, and it's not Sherlock Holmes. But
So I have a series that is going on at the moment that is the very first police officers of the NYPD. So Day One, Cop One, NYPD. Timothy Wilde is one of the first New York City police officers. After you write Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper, what do you do next?
right.
Do you put him on the Titanic? I mean, it was an iceberg. So this is always my answer to this question. It's almost impossible to do it again.
Yeah. Although I'm brewing a sort of a funnier one with Holmes on the Crippen case.
Oh, that would be fun.
Well, because everybody in the world at Crippen knew that he was being tracked. It was all over the media. It was all over the media at the time.
That would be completely fun. And the one novel idea that I have for Sherlock Holmes that I won't write for probably, I don't know, 10 or 20 years, but if I write a Sherlock Holmes novel again, it's going to be Sherlock Holmes in World War I, and it's going to be Watson. Clearly, already we know he was a liar. So, so he was definitely with Sherlock Holmes during all those Altamont exploits, and it would be Sherlock Holmes as a super spy in the middle of the First World War.
I've been toying with that too.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should collaborate.
Perhaps. It's like a pretty good idea, though, right?
Oh, it certainly is.
Yay!
Yeah, we could have Watson encounter Mata Hari.
Yeah. Oh man.
Well, the man of experience with the experience of living on 3 continents. Something Conan Doyle hardly ever touches.
3 continents, Watson.
Yeah.
Well done. Yes, I would love to write that book at a certain point. But I don't know when I will have the opportunity, because now I'm talking about more, the people that I made up in my head.
Well, that's what you have to do as a writer, is go with what they want.
Yeah.
What the characters want.
Yeah, that's true.
I am trying to write a collection of Sherlock Holmes short stories now, and it's driving me crazy.
Are you writing them just from the beginning, like I'm creating all the short stories and then?
Oh, no. I mean, I write the way I always write, you know.
No, I mean, like, do you already have the short stories and you're compiling them, or are you writing them, like, from the beginning?
Whenever I get an idea for a story, there are certain things that crystallize in my head. Several, 2 or 3, scenes that have to be written, and then I write those first. And then I take a look at them.
Tent poles. This is what I always call tent poles. Circus tent poles.
That's a good term for it. I'm going to steal that.
Circus tent poles. That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anyway, you have to fill in, and then you have to work backwards and fill in what's missing, and forwards to the logical and hopefully satisfying conclusion.
Yeah. Well.
And I can
One
do
does
that.
hope.
Yeah, well, I can do that in 40 or 50 pages, but the Conan Doyle length is about 20.
The Conan Doyle length, I don't know how many pages it is, but it's 7,000 words approximately, between 7 and 7,500 words, between 7 and 10 generally. And like I would say that 7,000 words is really lean for a Sherlock Holmes mystery, and so this is one of the reasons that I actually struggle writing for the Strand magazine, because I write for the Strand magazine periodically Sherlock Holmes pastiches, and they want me to land at 5. So 5,000 words as opposed to 7,000 words is just not as atmospheric.
It isn't. I need more space. Because my writing. Most of you know me as a reporter. Those of you who watch the show regularly, of course, Mom, you know. But the journalism is great for your discipline. It's great for getting all the facts right once. But you also write a lot of short sentences. And Conan Doyle never wrote a short sentence, and that's.
I don't think Conan Doyle wrote many short sentences. No, he did not.
And I have a hard. That's one of the reasons it took 20 years to finish Plague of Dracula.
Yeah.
Because having to get that voice right, going back. Okay. Next, we'll be talking to Eddy Webb, who is yet to write his first Sherlock Holmes pastiche, but he has written a book called Watson is Not an Idiot, in which he examines all the original Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle and gets into the characters, the details, and things like that. The reason for the title is the Nigel Bruce characterization of Watson in the Basil Rathbone films of the 1940s. In the books, Watson is anything but an idiot. He's just not a genius. He's like the rest of us, and essentially, he is Sherlock Holmes' link to humanity. So, Eddy Webb.
I've always been a strong fan of the original Sherlock Holmes canon, and I had some friends online who were getting into the new adaptations, the Robert Downey Jr. adaptation, the BBC adaptation, and they had perceptions of the characters really based on pop culture impressions of Holmes and Watson rather than what actually happened in the canon. And so I started writing a series of essays about each of the canonical stories and talking about what's actually in the canon and information about the era that they're written in and also how it applies to the modern adaptations. And I combined those together into a book called Watson is Not an Idiot.
Could you explain why you need that title?
The title comes from the perception of the Nigel Bruce interpretation of Watson. Particularly in the Universal films, there's an infamous scene where he steps into a bucket and doesn't even realize it's in a bucket. And these kinds of moments of Nigel Bruce's interpretation really presented Watson as being kind of a bumbling oaf.
Yeah.
And that has resonated through pop culture, that Watson fills this role of being kind of an idiot.
Yeah.
And that was one of the biggest points, one of the first points I always bring across to people is that Watson was a doctor, he was an army man, he was incredibly intelligent in his own right. In the canon, he had his own extremely acute observations, but in the context of Sherlock, he appears slow because Sherlock is so brilliant. It doesn't mean that Watson's dumb, just that he's not quite as brilliant as Holmes himself.
Oh yes, well I remember, I think the last Cumberbatch series, or maybe it was the second series, his Sherlock is saying, how do you stand being inside those heads? It must be so boring in there. But
Absolutely. I mean, when you are friends with someone, I'm a similar case. My wife is an anthropologist. She went to England to study the Scatterfield bones, and she told me all sorts of things about bones and how they're put together and how people live. She would look at someone's bone and tell you what kind of diseases they had, and how old they were, what gender they were. And there's really amazing information. I just feel like an idiot around her, but it's because it's very hard to see yourself when you have this bright light of someone who's so incredibly intelligent. And I feel that Watson's the same way. He plays himself down in the canon because he's like, well, I can't see these obvious things he's saying. But Watson doesn't give himself enough credit, and Holmes even calls him out in a canon and says, "You do yourself a disservice."
Yes. I always imagined, and actually I've thrown this into one of my stories, if nothing else, Watson has to be a better diagnostician.
Exactly.
If there was association with Holmes. And I would think Holmes, and should give Watson some credit, would know a lot more about medicine than he did ordinarily before they met.
Certainly, and what's interesting is in the early canon, especially, Watson does have more insights of his own, and then as you get to the later canon, it seems like those go away. And I think part of that's because Doyle fell into a trap that we all do, which is you get into a formula unconsciously or consciously, and he starts to put Watson into that subservient role. But early on in their relationship, Holmes is still kind of formulating his theories. Watson has had more experience than Holmes,
Yeah.
and so he